Good evening and welcome back to another journey through the ancient world. Tonight, we're stepping away from the thunder and the wars, the passion and the chaos that so often define the tales of Olympus. Tonight, we're turning our attention to something quieter, something warmer, something that in many ways was more essential to the ancient Greeks than all the lightning bolts Zeus could ever hurl. Tonight, we're talking about Hestia. Before you settle in, take a moment to let me know where in the world you're watching from. Are you curled up on a cozy couch as evening falls? Maybe it's the middle of the night where you are, and sleep eludes you. Wherever you are, whatever hour it is, you're welcome here. If you enjoy these deep dives into mythology, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if it genuinely brings you peace or curiosity or that gentle comfort of a well-told story. Now dim the lights if you can. Maybe light a candle. That would be fitting, actually, for what we're about to discuss. Let the world outside fade away. And let's begin. Hestia is not a name that echoes through the halls of mythology with the same thunder as Zeus, or the same beauty as Aphrodite, or the same cunning as Athena. She doesn't appear in grand epics, slaying monsters or falling in love with mortals or scheming against her divine siblings. She doesn't have temples rising on every hilltop or festivals filled with wild dancing and wine-soaked revelry. And yet, in her own way, Hestia was everywhere. She was the goddess of the hearth, the goddess of the home, the goddess of the fire that burned in the center of every house, every family, every city across the ancient Greek world. She was the firstborn daughter of the Titans, Cronus and Rhea, making her older than Zeus himself. She was one of the original 12 Olympians, though her place on that golden council would become a matter of quiet debate over the centuries. Hestia was different from the other gods. She didn't chase. She didn't fight. She didn't scheme or seduce or demand grand displays of worship. She simply was. Present, constant, reliable in a way that few other deities could claim. While her siblings threw themselves into wars and love affairs and political machinations, Hestia tended the flame. She kept the hearth burning. She made sure that when mortals looked for warmth, for safety, for the feeling of being home, they found it. In a pantheon filled with drama and contradiction, Hestia represented something simple yet profound. She was stability. She was peace. She was the quiet understanding that no matter how chaotic the world became, there would always be a fire to return to, a place to gather, a center that held. The ancient Greeks understood this. They might not have told elaborate stories about her, might not have carved her image into marble as often as they did Athena or Artemis, but they honored her every single day. Every time they lit the fire in their home, every time they shared a meal with family, every time they welcomed a stranger into their house and offered them food and warmth. In those moments, Hestia was there. She didn't need grand temples, because every hearth was her altar. She didn't need priests conducting elaborate ceremonies, because every person who tended a fire was her devotee. She didn't need myths to prove her worth, because her worth was written into the very fabric of Greek life. Tonight we're going to explore the story of this remarkable goddess. We'll talk about her birth, her choices, her quiet power. We'll discuss what the hearth meant to the ancient Greeks, and why Hestia's domain was so much more important than it might seem at first glance. We'll look at the few myths that do feature her, and we'll examine how her worship transformed when the Romans adopted her under a new name. And perhaps by the end, we'll understand why a goddess who never sought glory, never demanded attention, never made herself the center of any story, was nonetheless considered chief among the goddesses. Why she received the first offering at every sacrifice. Why her flame burned in every home and every city, because sometimes the quietest presence is the most essential. Sometimes the simplest role is the most profound. And sometimes the goddess who stays home is the one who holds everything together. So let's begin. Let's go back to the very beginning, to the time before Zeus ruled, before Olympus rose, before the hearth became sacred. Let's go back to the moment when Hestia was born and immediately swallowed, and her long, strange journey through the belly of time itself began. In the beginning there were Titans. Cronus ruled the cosmos, a king of terrible power and even more terrible paranoia. He had overthrown his own father, Uranus, castrating him with a sickle and seizing control of the universe. It was a brutal act, but one that Cronus perhaps saw as necessary. Uranus had been a cruel father, after all, imprisoning his monstrous children deep within the earth, causing their mother Gaia endless suffering. But as Cronus well knew, what goes around comes around. And Uranus, bleeding into the sea as he retreated to the sky, had cursed his son with a prophecy. Just as Cronus had overthrown his father, so too would one of Cronus's own children rise up and cast him down. So Cronus did what any sensible cosmic tyrant would do. He decided to eat his kids. His wife was Rhea, herself a Titan, daughter of Gaia and Uranus, just as Cronus was. She bore him children, and each time Cronus watched with hungry, fearful eyes. The moment each child was born, he snatched them up and swallowed them whole, sending them down into the darkness of his belly, where they could pose no threat to his rule. The first child was Hestia. Picture it, a newborn goddess barely drawing her first breath, and already her father's massive hand is reaching for her. There's no time for Rhea to protest, no time for anyone to intervene. Cronus opens his mouth, and down Hestia goes, tumbling into the abyss of his stomach, consciousness perhaps flickering in confusion, or perhaps not yet fully formed at all. What must that have been like? To exist, to be born, to take form as a divine being, only to be immediately imprisoned in darkness. The myths don't tell us. They move on quickly to the next child, and the next. Demeter followed Hestia into their father's belly. Then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. 5 children swallowed, one after another, each disappearing into the void. And then came the 6th, Zeus, the youngest, the last. Rhea had endured this horror 5 times. 5 times she had felt the joy of birth followed immediately by the anguish of loss. 5 times she had watched her husband devour their offspring, claiming it was necessary that the prophecy could not be allowed to come true. And now, carrying her 6th child, she knew she could not let it happen again. So she conspired with her mother, Gaia, who had seen enough of sons murdering fathers and fathers murdering sons. They came up with a plan. When Zeus was born, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to Cronus. And Cronus, perhaps too paranoid to think clearly, or perhaps simply arrogant enough to believe his wife would never dare deceive him, swallowed the stone without question. Zeus was spirited away, hidden on the island of Crete, or in some versions in a cave on Mount Ida, where he was raised by nymphs and fed on honey and the milk of the goat Amalthea. He grew up far from his father's watchful eyes, far from the threat of being devoured. He grew strong, he grew clever, he grew angry, and when he was ready, he returned. The story of Zeus forcing Cronus to regurgitate his siblings is well known. Zeus tricked his father into drinking a potion, often said to be a mixture of wine and mustard, which made Cronus violently ill. And up came the children, one by one, in reverse order from how they'd been swallowed. First came Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, and finally, last of all, came Hestia. She had been the first to be swallowed. Now she was the last to emerge. First in, last out. It was a strange paradox, one that the ancient Greeks found deeply meaningful. Because of this, Hestia was described as being both the eldest and the youngest of Cronus and Rhea's children. Eldest by birth, youngest by emergence. First and last, beginning and end. Think about what this means symbolically. Hestia bracketed her siblings' experience. She was there at the start of Cronus's fear, the very first victim of his paranoia, and she was there at the end of his reign, the final child to be freed before the great war between Titans and Olympians began. She witnessed the entire arc from beginning to end, from the first act of tyranny to the moment of liberation. And perhaps that experience shaped her. Perhaps those dark years, if time even passed in any normal way inside Cronus's belly, taught her something about patience, about waiting, about the importance of simply enduring, simply being, until the moment came for freedom and light. We don't know how conscious the swallowed children were during their imprisonment. Some versions of the myth suggest they were fully aware, trapped in darkness, perhaps even conversing with each other in that bizarre prison. Other versions imply they were in a kind of suspended animation, their consciousness frozen until Zeus freed them. Either way, when Hestia emerged, she did so as a fully formed goddess, ready to take her place among the Olympians. And what did she do with that freedom? She chose to serve, to nurture, to tend the flame. While her siblings prepared for war against the Titans, while Zeus gathered allies and forged thunderbolts and strategized how to overthrow their father once and for all, Hestia took on a different role. She became the keeper of the hearth, the one who maintained the sacred fire, the one who ensured that even in the midst of cosmic war there was a center, a home, a place of warmth and safety. This wasn't weakness. It wasn't lack of power or courage. It was a choice, a deliberate decision to embody something that the world desperately needed. Because what good is victory in war if there's no home to return to? What good is claiming the cosmos if there's no warmth, no family, no sense of belonging? Hestia understood this from the very beginning. She had been first and last. She had experienced both ends of the spectrum. She had waited in darkness and emerged into light. And from that experience, she chose to become the light that others could rely on, the constant flame, the hearth that never went out. Her siblings would go on to claim mighty domains. Zeus took the sky and became king of the gods. Poseidon claimed the seas and all the waters of the earth. Hades descended to rule the underworld, the realm of the dead. Hera became queen of heaven and goddess of marriage. Demeter took dominion over the harvest and the fertility of the earth. And Hestia, she claimed the hearth, the fire, the home. It might seem like a small domain compared to the sky or the sea, but to the ancient Greeks it was everything. The hearth was the center of life. It was where families gathered. It was where meals were cooked. It was where warmth was found on cold nights. It was where children were welcomed into the family. It was where guests were honored. It was where prayers were offered and sacrifices were made. The hearth was the heart, and Hestia was its goddess. She emerged from her father's belly last, but in the household order of sacrifices, she always came first. That's not a coincidence, that's recognition. The ancient Greeks understood that before you could honor Zeus or Athena or any of the other mighty Olympians, you had to honor the hearth, you had to honor the home, you had to honor Hestia. First and last, Alpha and Omega, beginning and end. That was Hestia's nature from the very start, and it would define everything that came after. Hestia was beautiful, though the Greeks rarely depicted her with the overt sensuality they lavished on Aphrodite or the regal elegance they gave to Hera. Her beauty was of a different kind, modest, serene, the kind of beauty found in simplicity, in clean lines, in the warm glow of firelight on a winter evening. And of course, being a goddess and being beautiful, she attracted attention. Two of the most powerful gods on Olympus came to seek her hand in marriage: Apollo, the golden god of music, prophecy, healing, and the sun, and Poseidon, lord of the seas, earth-shaker, master of horses and storms. Both approached Hestia with offers of marriage. Both wanted to make her their wife. Now these were not small offers. Apollo was brilliant and talented, patron of the arts and overseer of the great oracle at Delphi. To be his wife would mean a life filled with music and poetry, prophecy and healing, power and prestige. Poseidon, meanwhile, ruled the vast oceans, commanded the loyalty of all sea creatures, and had the power to cause earthquakes with a strike of his trident. To be his wife would mean dominion over the waters, a palace beneath the waves, power beyond imagining. Either choice would have elevated Hestia to a position of even greater prominence. She could have been a queen, a co-ruler, a partner to one of the mightiest gods in existence. She refused them both. The reasons for her refusal are not entirely spelled out in the ancient sources, but we can make some educated guesses based on what we know about Hestia's character and the dynamics of the Olympian family. First, there's the simple matter of her personality. Hestia valued peace, tranquility, and domestic harmony. Marriage to either Apollo or Poseidon would have meant entering into the complicated, often drama-filled world of divine politics and romance. Both gods had their share of affairs, rivalries, and conflicts. Neither was known for being particularly faithful or easy to live with. More than that, there was likely a practical concern. Apollo and Poseidon both wanted her. If she chose one, she would reject the other. And a rejected Olympian god, especially one as powerful as Apollo or Poseidon, could become vindictive. There could be jealousy, conflict, even war between the two suitors. Hestia, ever the peacekeeper, would have seen this coming. By choosing neither, she avoided causing a rift. By remaining unwed, She maintained harmony. But perhaps the deepest reason was this. Hestia didn't want to belong to anyone. She wanted to belong to everyone. As a wife, she would have been one god's partner, one household's matriarch, defined in relation to someone else. But as a virgin goddess, as the keeper of the hearth who belonged to no one god in particular, she could be universal. She could be present in every home. She could belong to every family. She could serve all of humanity without being bound to any single individual. So she went to Zeus, her youngest brother, now king of the gods, and she made a request. She asked for his permission to remain a virgin forever. She wanted to take a vow of eternal chastity, to dedicate herself fully to her role as keeper of the hearth, unencumbered by the complications of marriage or motherhood. Zeus agreed immediately. Some versions of the story say that Zeus was touched by her request, recognizing the nobility and selflessness in it. Other versions suggest that Zeus, who had his own complicated love life, and who knew all too well the conflicts that romantic entanglements could cause among the gods, was simply relieved that Hestia was choosing to opt out of the whole mess. Either way, he granted her wish, and he gave her a gift in return. Zeus declared that Hestia would receive the highest honor. She would be given the first offering at every sacrifice. In all the temples of the gods, in all the homes of mortals, whenever anyone made a sacrifice to the divine, the first portion would go to Hestia. She would be honored before Zeus himself, before mighty Poseidon, before wise Athena. First and always, Hestia would receive her due. This was an extraordinary privilege. In the ancient world, precedence mattered. The order in which honors were given, the order in which names were spoken, these things signified power and importance. By declaring that Hestia would always come first, Zeus was elevating her above all the other gods in a very specific and meaningful way. And so Hestia took her vow. She swore to remain a virgin, to never marry, to never bear children. She joined Athena and Artemis as one of the three great virgin goddesses of Olympus, though her virginity meant something slightly different from theirs. Athena's virginity was tied to her identity as a warrior and strategist, a deity who could not be conquered or subdued. Artemis's virginity was connected to her wildness, her independence, her dominion over the untamed wilderness and the hunt. Hestia's virginity was about preservation. It was about maintaining the purity of the hearth, the sanctity of the home. Fire itself was seen as a pure element, a cleansing force. A hearth that went out was considered a bad omen, a sign that the goddess had withdrawn her favor. By remaining a virgin, Hestia embodied the eternal flame, the fire that never goes out, the light that never dims. And she was content with this, more than content, fulfilled. While other goddesses schemed and competed for the affections of gods and mortals, while they fought over who was most beautiful or most powerful or most worthy of praise, Hestia simply tended her fire. She maintained her role. She kept the home fires burning, quite literally. There's something almost radical about this choice, especially in the context of Greek mythology, where so much revolves around romance, sex, desire, and power struggles between lovers. Hestia rejected all of that. She said no to marriage, no to children, no to the entire apparatus of divine romance. And in doing so, she carved out a space for herself that was uniquely hers, defined by service rather than possession, by constancy rather than conquest. The ancient Greeks respected this enormously. In a society where women were often defined primarily through their relationships to men, either as daughters, wives, or mothers, Hestia represented something different. She was autonomous, self-determined. She had power not because of who she was married to or who her children were, but because of what she did, what she represented, what she maintained. And mortals understood that they could always count on her. Unlike the other gods who were capricious and temperamental, who might help you one day and curse you the next depending on their mood, Hestia was reliable. She didn't play favorites. She didn't punish people for perceived slights. She simply was there always in every hearth, in every home, providing warmth and light and a sense of security. When a family lit their evening fire, Hestia was present. When they gathered around the hearth to share a meal, she was honored. When they welcomed a guest and offered them food and warmth, they were participating in Hestia's domain, enacting her values of hospitality and generosity. And because she remained a virgin, Because she refused to be drawn into the romantic and sexual dramas that consumed so many of the other gods, she could focus entirely on this role. She could be the goddess of home and hearth without distraction, without complication, without the compromises that marriage and motherhood would have required. In later centuries, some philosophers and writers would interpret Hestia's virginity in more abstract terms. They saw her as representing the philosophical concept of the center, the fixed point around which everything else revolves. Just as the hearth was the center of the home, Hestia was the center of cosmic order, the still point in a turning universe. Her virginity, her refusal to be moved or changed by external forces, reflected this fixedness, this permanence. Whether the ancient Greeks thought of it in quite these philosophical terms is debatable, but they certainly understood, on a practical and spiritual level, that Hestia's choice to remain unwed made her more available, more present, more reliably there for them. She was everyone's goddess, no one's wife, every family's protector, no one's exclusive property. And so the hearth remained sacred, and the fire kept burning, and Hestia, content in her choice, tended the flame that would never go out. To understand Hestia, you need to understand what the hearth meant to the ancient Greeks. In the modern world, we have furnaces and electric heaters, stoves and ovens, all separate appliances with different functions. But in the ancient world, the hearth was all of these things and more. It was the single most important physical feature of any dwelling, and it served multiple essential purposes. First and most obviously, the hearth provided heat. Greek winters, particularly in the northern regions and mountainous areas, could be quite cold. Homes were built of stone and wood, often with minimal insulation. The hearth fire kept the family warm during the cold months, literally making the difference between life and death. Second, the hearth was where food was prepared. All cooking happened at the hearth. Bread was baked there, stews were cooked there, meat was roasted there. The hearth was the kitchen, and control of the hearth meant control of the family's sustenance. This was typically the domain of the women of the household, though not exclusively. The person who tended the hearth, who kept the fire burning and prepared the meals, held a position of essential importance. Third, the hearth served as a social center. This is where the family gathered, especially in the evenings. After a day of work, the family would come together around the hearth, drawn by its warmth and light. Stories were told there, news was shared there, decisions were made there. The hearth was where the family actually became a family, where bonds were formed and maintained. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly for our discussion, the hearth was a religious altar. Every hearth was considered sacred, a sanctuary of Hestia herself. When a sacrifice was made to any god, a portion was always burned in the hearth fire, with the first offering going to Hestia. The smoke rising from the hearth carried prayers and offerings to the divine realm. The hearth was thus the primary point of contact between the mortal family and the gods. Because of all these functions, the hearth was never placed casually. It was always positioned at the center of the home. In the typical Greek house, particularly in earlier periods, there was a main room called the megaron, and the hearth sat at its center. Everything else in the house was organized around it. The hearth was the axis, the focal point, the heart of the home in every sense, and the fire in the hearth was never, ever supposed to go out. This was critically important. A hearth fire that went out was considered a disaster, a sign that Hestia had withdrawn her blessing from the household. If the fire did go out accidentally, it couldn't simply be relit with a flint or by borrowing flame from a neighbor. No, it had to be relit through special means to restore its sacred nature. One method was to create fire through friction, laboriously rubbing sticks together until the heat generated flame. Another method, available during the day, was to use a burning glass to focus sunlight and ignite the kindling. These were not quick or easy processes, which is why families were so careful to never let the hearth fire die. The penalty for letting the hearth fire go out was more than just inconvenience. It was spiritual failure. It meant the family had been negligent in their care of Hestia's domain. It meant the sanctity of the home had been compromised. And while Hestia herself was not a vengeful goddess who would punish such failures with dramatic curses, the Greeks believed that a house without a proper hearth fire was a house without divine protection, vulnerable to all manner of misfortune. When a new family was formed through marriage, one of the central rituals involved the hearth. The bride, leaving her father's house to join her husband's household, would participate in a ceremony where she was introduced to the hearth of her new home. She would be led around it in a ritual called amphidromia, walking in a circle around the fire, sometimes while offerings of figs and nuts were scattered. This ceremony placed her under Hestia's protection and officially made her part of the family. Similarly, when a child was born, the infant would be carried around the hearth in a similar ritual, usually on the 5th day after birth. This was the moment when the child was officially accepted into the family and community. By being presented at Hestia's hearth, the baby was placed under the goddess's care and acknowledged as a member of the household. If someone died in the family, the hearth played a role in mourning as well. In some Greek regions, the hearth fire would be extinguished when a family member died, then ritually rekindled to symbolize the continuation of the family despite the loss. In other regions, the fire was never extinguished, but special offerings were made at the hearth for the deceased. The hearth also had a legal function. In many Greek city-states, touching the hearth of a house gave a supplicant the right to asylum. If someone fleeing danger or persecution managed to reach a household's hearth and touch it, the family was obligated to protect them. The hearth was sacred ground, inviolable, and anyone who harmed a supplicant at the hearth risked the wrath of the gods, particularly Hestia. This concept of the hearth as sanctuary extended beyond individual households. In the public sphere, city-states maintained public hearths in buildings called prytaneions, and these served as official sanctuaries where suppliants could seek protection. Foreign ambassadors, fugitives seeking clemency, citizens caught in legal disputes, all could appeal to the public hearth for refuge and fair treatment. Every meal was a religious act. Before eating, the family would make offerings to Hestia, typically burning a small portion of the food in the hearth fire or pouring a libation of wine. The first portion always went to Hestia, in keeping with Zeus's decree. The last portion often went to her as well, bookending the meal with recognition of the goddess who made the meal possible. The common Greek phrase, "begin with Hestia," came to mean start things the right way, or do things properly, acknowledging that proper attention to the hearth and to Hestia was the foundation of all correct action. Interestingly, precisely because the hearth was so ubiquitous, precisely because every home had one and every hearth was a shrine to Hestia, there were relatively few standalone temples dedicated to her. She didn't need them. She already had countless altars, one in every house in Greece. While other gods required elaborate temples to house their images and serve as centers of worship, Hestia's worship was decentralized, domestic, everyday. She was not honored with grand festivals and processions, but with daily intimate acts of devotion. That said, there were some notable public spaces dedicated to Hestia. The town of Hermione in Argolis had a temple to her, though it notably contained no statue of the goddess, only an altar. This was characteristic of Hestia worship. She was often represented by the fire itself rather than by an image. The flame was her body, in a sense, her physical manifestation in the world. Perhaps the most philosophically sophisticated understanding of the hearth comes from Plato, who in his dialogue, Cratylus, explored the meaning of the gods' names. Plato, or rather his character Socrates, suggests that Hestia is related to ousia, the Greek word for essence or being. In this interpretation, Hestia represents the fundamental reality of things, the essence at the center of existence. Just as the hearth is the center of the home, Hestia is the center of being itself. Whether or not the average Greek farmer or merchant thought in such lofty terms is questionable, but they certainly understood in their bones that the hearth was essential, that Hestia's domain was not small or insignificant, but was, in fact, the foundation of everything else. Without the hearth, there was no home. Without the home, there was no family. Without the family, there was no society. Without society, there was no civilization. Hestia was the beginning of the chain, the first link, the essential foundation. And so every morning when the fire was stirred to life, Hestia was honored. Every evening when the family gathered for their meal, Hestia was present. Every night when the fire was banked so it would last until morning, Hestia was trusted to keep watch. She was there always, in the warmth, in the light, in the smell of bread baking and stew bubbling. in the laughter of children and the quiet conversations of adults, in the very center of what it meant to be home. That was Hestia's realm. That was her power. Not loud or flashy or dramatic, but constant, essential, as necessary as breath itself. If Hestia's presence in the home was essential, her role in the broader civic life of Greek city-states was equally important, though in a way that might seem paradoxical for such a domestic goddess. But the Greeks understood something crucial. A city was just an extension of the family, a household writ large. And just as every home needed a hearth, so did every city. Each Greek city-state had a public building called a prytaneion, which served as a kind of town hall. This was where city officials met, where important guests were received, where certain civic rituals were performed. And at the heart of the prytaneion was Hestia's sacred hearth with its eternal flame. This wasn't just a symbolic fire. It was a working hearth where actual sacrifices were burned and actual meals were prepared. City officials, called prytanes, who were responsible for various administrative duties, would offer sacrifices to Hestia when they entered office. It was a way of consecrating their service to the city, of invoking the goddess's blessing on their work, of acknowledging that their duty was to maintain the civic home, just as a family patriarch maintained the domestic home. The public hearth represented the unity and continuity of the city-state. Just as a family's hearth fire ideally never went out, neither did the fire in the prytaneion. It burned constantly, day and night, year after year, a physical manifestation of the city's ongoing existence. If through some catastrophe or neglect, the public hearth fire was extinguished, it was a crisis of the highest order, suggesting that the city itself was in mortal danger. When I say these fires were meant to burn eternally, I mean it quite literally. Some of these public hearth fires burned for centuries without being extinguished. They were tended by specially appointed officials, often from prominent families, who took the responsibility of maintaining the flame very seriously. It was both a practical duty and a sacred trust. The importance of the public hearth became especially clear during colonization. From the 8th century BCE onward, Greek city-states began sending out colonies to establish new settlements around the Mediterranean and Black Sea. These weren't just trading posts or military outposts. They were meant to be fully functioning Greek cities in their own right, complete with their own governments, temples, and civic institutions. But there was a problem. How do you establish the legitimacy of a new city? How do you create the sense that this new settlement is truly Greek, truly connected to the ancient traditions and the favor of the gods? The answer lay in fire. When colonists left their mother city to establish a new settlement, they would take with them fire from the public hearth. This wasn't just any fire. It was flame directly from Hestia's altar in the prytaneion. This sacred fire would be carefully transported to the new location, never allowed to go out during the journey, and would be used to light the hearth in the new city's prytaneion. Think about what this meant. The new city's hearth was literally descended from the old city's hearth. The flame was the same flame, carrying with it the blessing and legitimacy of the mother city. It created a physical, tangible link between the colony and its homeland, a link made of light and heat and the presence of Hestia herself. This practice created a kind of genealogy of fire, a family tree of flames that stretched across the Greek world. A colony in southern Italy might trace its hearth fire back to Athens. A settlement on the Black Sea coast might carry flame originally kindled in Miletus. And Miletus itself might trace its civic fire back to an even older city. These links of light bound the scattered Greek cities together into a larger community, even when they were politically independent from one another. When foreign ambassadors visited a Greek city-state, they would often be received at the prytaneion in the presence of Hestia's hearth. This was significant. By bringing foreign dignitaries to the sacred hearth, the city was extending its protection to them, treating them as honored guests within the civic household. The hearth represented hospitality on a grand scale, the xenia that the Greeks considered so important. To be welcomed at the public hearth was to be welcomed into the heart of the city itself. The prytaneion also served as a sanctuary, much like domestic hearths did. Someone fleeing persecution could seek asylum at the public hearth, and by ancient law and custom, they were to be protected there. To violate this sanctuary, to harm someone who had reached the hearth, was considered a grave sacrilege. The historian Diodorus Siculus recounts a dramatic example of this. A man named Theramenes, facing execution during political upheaval in Athens, leaped onto the hearth in the council chamber. He did this not because he expected to be saved, but because he wanted his executioners to demonstrate their impiety by killing him there, at Hestia's altar. It was a powerful final protest, forcing them to violate sacred space in order to carry out his death sentence. Some cities went so far as to grant certain honored citizens the privilege of dining in the prytaneion for life. This was called psittasis, and it was one of the highest honors a city could bestow. Olympic victors, great generals, distinguished philosophers, poets who had brought glory to the city, all might be granted psittasis. They would take their meals at the public hearth, literally eating at Hestia's table, supported by the city in perpetuity. It was recognition of their service, but it was also symbolic. These individuals had become part of the city's core, as essential to the civic body as the hearth itself. Pausanias, the ancient travel writer, mentions that the prytaneion in Athens contained statues of the goddesses Irene and Hestia. Irene was the personification of peace, and her presence alongside Hestia makes perfect sense. Peace and the hearth go hand in hand. War displaces people from their homes, disrupts families, makes the maintenance of hearth and home difficult or impossible. A city that honors both Irene and Hestia is declaring that it values peace, stability, domestic tranquility, and the preservation of communal bonds over conquest and glory. Hestia's political role also extended to oath-taking. Oaths sworn by Hestia were considered especially binding because she was seen as incorruptible, unchanging, honest. Other gods might be appealed to with flattery or offerings, might be negotiated with or even tricked in mythology. But Hestia simply was what she was, constant and true. An oath sworn by her name was an oath you were expected to keep, no matter what. In some philosophical and mystical traditions of later antiquity, the concept of the public hearth took on even grander meaning. Philosophers began to speak of a cosmic hearth, a fire at the center of the universe that corresponded to Hestia, just as the hearth in each home corresponded to her. In this view, Hestia wasn't just a goddess who protected domestic and civic hearths, she was the organizing principle of reality itself, the center around which everything else revolved. The pre-Socratic philosopher Philolaus, for instance, proposed a cosmology in which there was a central fire at the heart of the universe, around which the earth, sun, moon, and other celestial bodies revolved. While Philolaus didn't necessarily identify this central fire directly with Hestia, later thinkers made that connection. Hestia became, in these mystical interpretations, the fixed point, the unmoved mover, the still center of a turning cosmos. Whether such philosophical speculations reflected popular belief is doubtful. The average Greek probably didn't spend much time contemplating cosmic hearths, but they did understand that Hestia was important not just to their individual families, but to the larger community, to the city itself, to the concept of civic unity and continuity. When they walked past the prytaneion and saw the smoke rising from Hestia's eternal flame, they knew that the city endured, that their community was protected, that there was a center that held. And perhaps that's what Hestia ultimately represented in the public sphere. The idea that despite all the conflicts and changes, despite political upheavals and wars and the rise and fall of leaders, there was something constant, something unchanging, something that remained at the heart of it all, providing warmth and light, and the assurance that this place, this community, this collective household called a city, was still home. There's a phrase that appears repeatedly in ancient Greek literature, "Begin with Hestia." It meant, on the surface, that when making a sacrifice to the gods, you should offer to Hestia first. But it came to have a broader meaning, almost proverbial. Begin with Hestia meant start things the right way, do things properly, attend to the fundamentals before moving on to other matters. This priority given to Hestia wasn't just custom or tradition, it was divine decree. Zeus himself had established that Hestia would receive the first portion of every sacrifice, the first libation of wine, the first prayer. And because sacrifices were offered to multiple gods, often to the entire Olympian pantheon during major festivals, This meant that Hestia was invoked and honored before any other deity, before Zeus the all-powerful, before Athena the wise, before Apollo, Artemis, Aphrodite, or any of the rest. Hestia came first. Think about what this means in terms of divine hierarchy. The ancient Greeks were very conscious of status, of proper order, of who sat where and who was honored when. By insisting that Hestia always received the first offering, Zeus was making a radical statement about values. He was saying that the domestic sphere, the realm of hearth and home, took precedence over everything else. That before you could properly honor the gods of war or love or wisdom or the sea, you had to honor the goddess of the home. It was a recognition that all the other divine domains depended on Hestia's. What good was victory in war if there was no home to return to? What good was a bountiful harvest if there was no hearth to cook the food? What good was love or wisdom or any of the other things the gods represented if there was no stable domestic foundation? Hestia was the prerequisite, the necessary condition, the foundation on which everything else was built. The mechanics of how this worked in practice varied, depending on the type of sacrifice, but generally followed a pattern. When a family made a sacrifice at their domestic hearth, they would throw the first portion of the offering into the fire while saying a prayer to Hestia. Only after that would they invoke whatever other gods were relevant to the occasion. If they were giving thanks for a good harvest, they would honor Hestia first, then Demeter. If they were praying for success in a sea voyage, Hestia first, then Poseidon. If they were making an offering on the occasion of a wedding, Hestia first, then Hera. At public sacrifices, which could be much more elaborate affairs involving multiple animals, professional priests, and large crowds, the pattern was the same, but on a grander scale. The ceremony would begin with an invocation to Hestia. The first portions of the sacrificial meat would be burned in her honor. Wine would be poured, and the first drops would be for Hestia. Only then would the priests move on to honor the other gods. This practice was so ingrained that it appears as a recurring formula in Greek poetry and literature. The Homeric hymns, a collection of ancient Greek poems dedicated to various deities, include two short hymns to Hestia. Hymn 24 begins, Hestia, you who tend the holy house of the Lord Apollo, the far shooter at goodly Pytho, with soft oil dripping ever from your locks, come now into this house. Come, having one mind with Zeus the all-wise, draw near, and withal bestow grace upon my song. Notice that the hymn positions Hestia as tending Apollo's temple. Even the great god Apollo, patron of the arts and prophecy, relies on Hestia to maintain his sacred space. She's not subservient to him. She's providing an essential service that makes his worship possible. Hymn 29 pairs Hestia with Hermes, which is an interesting combination. Hermes was the god of boundaries, of transitions, of movement and communication and commerce. He was constantly on the move, always crossing from one place to another, always in between. Hestia, by contrast, was utterly stationary. She stayed at the hearth. She represented stability and fixedness. Together, they represented complementary aspects of Greek life, the home and the world beyond it, the domestic and the public, staying and going. The hymn reads, Hestia, in the high dwellings of all, both deathless gods and men who walk on earth, you have gained an everlasting abode and highest honor. Glorious is your portion and your right. For without you mortals hold no banquet, where one does not duly pour sweet wine in offering to Hestia both first and last. There it is again, first and last. Hestia received offerings at the beginning and the end of the sacrifice. She bracketed the entire ritual, Alpha and Omega, and the hymn explicitly states that without her, no proper banquet or religious ceremony could take place. She was essential. The poet Pindar, in his 11th Nemean ode, addresses Hestia as daughter of Rhea, guardian of parliaments, linking her to civic governance as well as the domestic sphere. He describes how the people of the island of Tenedos honor her above all other gods, offering her many gifts of wine and sacrificial victims. It's a reminder that while Hestia may have been less prominent in mythology, she was absolutely central to actual religious practice. This priority extended even to the philosophical realm. When Plato's character Socrates discusses the names and natures of the gods in the Cratylus, he begins with Hestia, according to custom. Even in philosophical discourse, The tradition of beginning with Hestia was maintained. It wasn't just piety, it was a recognition that any inquiry into the divine had to start with the most fundamental concepts, and Hestia represented the foundation, the essence, the ousia at the heart of things. Interestingly, precisely because Hestia was honored first at every sacrifice, she didn't need to compete for attention the way some of the other gods did. She didn't need to make dramatic appearances, didn't need to assert her power through grand displays. She was already guaranteed her honor. Every single time the Greeks performed a religious rite, they started with her. She was so firmly established in the ritual order that she could afford to be quiet, modest, undemanding. Compare this to gods like Apollo or Artemis, who had major festivals with processions, athletic competitions, dramatic performances, and lavish sacrifices. Or to Dionysus, whose festivals were famous for their wildness and excess. Or to Aphrodite, whose worship included sacred prostitution at some temples. These gods needed spectacle to maintain their hold on worshippers' attention. They needed to be dramatic and exciting, and occasionally scandalous to remain relevant. Hestia needed none of that. She was already woven into the fabric of daily life so thoroughly that she couldn't be forgotten. Every meal, every sacrifice, every prayer, every lighting of the hearth fire was an act of Hestia worship. She didn't need festivals because every day was her festival. She didn't need temples because every hearth was her temple. She didn't need priests because every person who tended a fire was her priest. There's a modern parallel that might help illustrate this. Think about the infrastructure of a city, the electrical grid, the water system, the sewage treatment, the roads. These are absolutely essential. Without them, the city couldn't function. But most of the time, they're invisible. We don't think about them unless they break down. We don't celebrate the water flowing from our taps or the electricity powering our lights because they're just always there. That was Hestia. She was the infrastructure of Greek religious life, essential, ubiquitous, always present but rarely celebrated with fanfare because she didn't need fanfare. She was so reliable, so constant, so fundamental that the Greeks could take her presence for granted, while still honoring her at every opportunity. And perhaps that's the greatest compliment of all. Not to be praised loudly, but to be trusted absolutely. Not to be the center of stories, but to be the center of life itself. Not to demand attention, but to deserve it. To receive it naturally, as a matter of course, because everyone understood that without Hestia, nothing else could function properly. First among the gods, not in power, perhaps, not in drama or excitement, but in order, in precedence, in the fundamental hierarchy of what mattered. Begin with Hestia, always, because everything else depended on her. If you go looking for Hestia in Greek mythology, you'll be disappointed. She's barely there. She doesn't appear in Homer's epics, those foundational texts of Greek literature that shaped so much of how the Greeks understood their gods and heroes. She's not in the Iliad, the tale of the Trojan War where gods and goddesses pick sides and intervene directly in battles. She's not in the Odyssey, the story of Odysseus's long journey home, though you might expect a goddess of the hearth to show up in a story so concerned with homecoming. She doesn't feature in the great tragic plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, or Euripides, where gods frequently appear as characters to drive the plot or deliver divine judgment. She doesn't show up in the comedies of Aristophanes, even though he frequently mocked the gods and their foibles. She's barely mentioned in the Theogony, Hesiod's account of the origin of the gods and the cosmos, except to note that she was the firstborn of Cronus and Rhea, and that she swore to remain a virgin. That's it. No stories about her youth, no tales of adventures or conflicts, no extended accounts of her powers or personality. Why? The simplest answer is that Hestia didn't leave the hearth. While other gods roamed the world, involved themselves in mortal affairs, fought wars, fell in love, schemed against each other, and generally made their presence known through dramatic action, Hestia stayed home. She tended the fire, she maintained the hearth, she did her job quietly, consistently, without fanfare. And mythology, particularly the kind of mythology that makes for good stories, thrives on conflict, drama, transformation. It needs characters who act, who want things, who clash with others, who make mistakes, who triumph and fail and learn and change. Hestia didn't do any of that. She was constant, unchanging, Peaceful. She had no enemies, no rivals, no love affairs, no tragic flaws. She was, in short, not particularly interesting from a narrative standpoint, but that doesn't mean she wasn't important. It just means her importance expressed itself in ways that didn't lend themselves to epic poetry or dramatic plays. You can't write an exciting story about someone maintaining something, about someone simply being there, reliable and steady. There's no plot in constancy, no dramatic arc in dependability. The few myths that do involve Hestia tend to emphasize her character: peaceful, modest, content with her role, uninterested in competition or conflict. The story of her vow of virginity is really the only extended narrative about her, and even that is less a story and more a brief anecdote explaining why she never married. There's no real drama to it. She's propositioned by Apollo and Poseidon. She says no to both. She asks Zeus for permission to remain a virgin. He grants it. She takes her place at the hearth. The end. No heartbreak, no conflict, no difficult choices or tragic consequences. Just a decision made and accepted. This stands in stark contrast to stories of other gods. When Hades wanted to marry Persephone, he kidnapped her, causing her mother Demeter to plunge the world into eternal winter until a compromise was reached. When Zeus wanted Semele, he visited her disguised as a mortal, then accidentally killed her when she asked to see his true form. When Aphrodite cheated on Hephaestus with Ares, Hephaestus caught them in a magic net and displayed them to the other gods, causing massive embarrassment and gossip. These are stories. They have drama, conflict, emotion, consequences. Hestia's story is she chose to stay a virgin so she could focus on her work and maintain peace on Olympus. It's admirable, but it's not exciting. The one myth that does involve Hestia in something resembling a conflict is the story of Priapus, which we'll discuss shortly. But even that is really more about Priapus than about Hestia. She's essentially passive in the story, the victim of an attempted assault, rather than an active agent driving the plot. In terms of personality, what we can glean from the scarce references suggests that Hestia was kind, modest, peaceful, and dedicated. She wasn't jealous like Hera, wasn't vain like Aphrodite, wasn't wrathful like Ares, wasn't cunning like Hermes, wasn't ambitious like Athena. She was content, satisfied with her role. She didn't seek glory or power or recognition beyond what was already given to her. The ancient Greeks sometimes described her with epithets like bountiful, eternal, and she of the public hearth. These weren't the dramatic epithets given to other gods. Zeus wasn't just Zeus, but Zeus the Thunderer, Zeus the Cloud Gatherer, Zeus the father of gods and men. Hestia was just Hestia, sometimes with a simple modifier, but often just her name, as if her name alone was enough. There's a philosophical concept in Taoism, a Chinese tradition admittedly far removed from ancient Greece, that might nonetheless illuminate Hestia's nature: Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action. It's the idea that the highest form of action is to act in perfect harmony with the natural order, without force, without striving, so that what you do seems effortless and natural. The Taoist sage doesn't try to control the world, but aligns with it, and in doing so achieves more than someone who fights against the current. Hestia embodies something similar. She doesn't force anything. She doesn't demand anything. She simply is, and in being, she accomplishes everything she needs to accomplish. The hearth doesn't struggle to be warm. It simply is warm. The fire doesn't strive to provide light. It simply provides light by its nature. Hestia is the divine equivalent of that natural, effortless efficacy. Her relationship with the other Olympians seems to have been uniformly positive. There are no myths of her arguing with her siblings, no tales of Hestia seeking revenge or nursing grudges or competing for status. When the conspiracy against Zeus was being planned by Hera, Poseidon, and others, Hestia wasn't involved. She remained neutral, faithful to her brother, the king of the gods, not out of fear or calculation, but apparently out of simple loyalty and an aversion to conflict. The other gods seem to have respected her enormously. They didn't mock her for her modest role or try to draw her into their dramas. They honored her priority and sacrifices without question. They acknowledged her importance even if they didn't tell stories about her. In a family of gods famous for their dysfunction, their feuds, their jealousies and rivalries, Hestia was the one stable, peaceful presence that everyone could agree was good and worthy. There's a word in Greek, eidos, which is difficult to translate but encompasses concepts like shame, honor, respect, and a sense of proper boundaries. It's the feeling that prevents you from doing something shameful, that makes you respect others, that gives you a sense of propriety and dignity. Hestia embodied eidos. She knew her place, not in a subservient way, but in a way that recognized what was appropriate, what was proper, what was right. And because she embodied this virtue, others treated her with corresponding respect. In a way, Hestia's absence from mythology is itself a kind of testament to her character. She didn't need to be in the stories. She didn't want to be in the stories. She was perfectly content to let others have the spotlight while she did her essential work in the background. And the Greeks, understanding this, didn't try to force her into narratives where she didn't belong. They let her be who she was, the quiet goddess, the constant presence, the still center that held everything together, without needing to announce herself. Sometimes the absence of drama is itself significant. Sometimes the fact that a deity doesn't appear in conflict-ridden myths tells you something important about their nature. Hestia's quiet suggests not weakness or irrelevance, but rather a kind of perfection, a completeness that doesn't need the validation of stories, because the reality she represents is self-evidently valuable. The hearth doesn't need to prove itself. It simply warms. It simply lights. It simply is. And so was Hestia. There is one story, preserved primarily in Ovid's Fasti, that involves Hestia in what might be called an adventure, though it's a disturbing one. Priapus was a minor fertility god, son of Dionysus and Aphrodite in most accounts, though his parentage varies in different sources. He was characterized by one distinctive grotesque feature, a permanently erect phallus of enormous size. This wasn't portrayed as a blessing, but rather as a curse inflicted on him, probably by Hera, who had a habit of punishing Aphrodite's children as revenge for Zeus's infidelities. Priapus was not one of the great Olympians. He dwelt in gardens and fields, where crude statues of him were placed as scarecrows and symbols of fertility. He was considered somewhat ridiculous, somewhat pathetic, a god of grotesque fertility rather than graceful divine power. But he was also dangerous, particularly to women, as he was characterized by uncontrolled lust. The story goes that during a feast of the gods, everyone had drunk heavily and many had fallen asleep. Hestia, exhausted from her duties, lay down to rest on the grass, finding a quiet spot away from the revelry. She was, as always, modest, simply wanting some peaceful sleep. Priapus, wandering drunkenly through the feast, spotted her. Now the sources differ on whether he knew who she was. Ovid suggests it's unclear whether Priapus recognized Hestia as an Olympian goddess or mistook her for a nymph. This distinction matters because there's an implication that assaulting a nymph might have been considered less transgressive than assaulting one of the great goddesses, a sentiment that tells us something troubling about ancient attitudes towards sexual violence and hierarchy. Either way, Priapus decided to take advantage of Hestia's unconscious state. He crept toward her, trying to move silently, his heart pounding with anticipation of his vile deed. What saved Hestia was pure chance. Silenus, the old satyr companion of Dionysus, had ridden to the feast on a donkey. The animal had been left to rest nearby, and as Priapus approached the sleeping Hestia, the donkey suddenly let out a loud, raucous bray. The noise startled Hestia awake. She saw Priapus advancing toward her and screamed. Her cries woke the other gods, who came running. Priapus, caught in the act, fled in shame and fear. The gods attacked him, driving him away from their gathering, making it clear that he was no longer welcome among them. Hestia's virginity was preserved, her purity remained intact, and the donkey, in some versions of the story, became sacred to her as a reward for its timely intervention. In other versions, Priapus later killed the donkey in revenge, and Dionysus placed it in the stars as a constellation. This story, brief as it is, raises several interesting points. First, it's one of the very few myths where Hestia is even present at a gathering of gods, let alone the focus of the narrative. The fact that it involves an attempted sexual assault is significant. Hestia's virginity was not just a personal choice, but a fundamental aspect of her divine nature, tied to the purity of the hearth and the sanctity of the home. An assault on Hestia would have been an assault on those concepts themselves. Second, the story reinforces Hestia's vulnerability and the protective instinct the other gods had toward her. She didn't defend herself with divine power, didn't strike Priapus down with a bolt of fire or any other supernatural means. She screamed for help, and the other gods came to her defense. This portrayal of Hestia as needing protection, as being somewhat passive even in her own defense, fits with her general characterization as a peaceful, non-confrontational deity. But it also suggests that the other Olympians took her protection seriously, that violating her was seen as a grave offense worthy of collective punishment. Third, the role of the donkey is interesting. In a narrative sense, the donkey functions as deus ex machina, the random intervention that saves the day. But symbolically, the donkey's bray represents the voice of the natural world itself, crying out against an unnatural violation. The hearth is natural, wholesome, life-giving. Sexual violence, particularly against a virgin goddess, is presented as unnatural, offensive to the cosmic order. It's worth noting that this story comes to us primarily from Ovid, a Roman poet writing centuries after the classical Greek period. Ovid was known for his interest in transformation and in sexual themes, often portrayed with a somewhat ironic or cynical edge. His treatment of the gods was rarely reverential in the straightforward sense, so we should be cautious about treating his version of this story as necessarily reflecting older Greek beliefs. In fact, Ovid tells essentially the same story twice in the Fasti, with different targets. In one version, the victim is the nymph Lotis, who is saved by the same braying donkey and subsequently transformed into a lotus plant. In another version, the victim is Vesta, the Roman equivalent of Hestia. The repetition suggests that Ovid might have been working with a traditional motif, a kind of folk tale about Priapus's failed assaults, and adapting it to different characters. The Greeks themselves don't seem to have told many stories about Priapus attempting to assault major goddesses. He was more associated with nymphs and rural settings, fitting his status as a minor agricultural deity. The application of the story to Hestia Vesta might have been a later development, perhaps intended to explain why donkeys were considered sacred to the goddess, or perhaps simply as a way of including her in at least one mythological narrative. Regardless of its origins, the story serves to reinforce several things about Hestia. Her virginity was inviolable and protected by the divine community. She was vulnerable in ways that more warlike goddesses like Athena or Artemis were not, relying on circumstance and the intervention of others rather than on her own martial prowess. She was a victim of male lust, but was preserved from violation, maintaining her purity. And even in this one story, where she's actually involved in a plot, she remains essentially passive, acted upon rather than acting. It's a troubling story in many ways, particularly when viewed through modern eyes. The attempted assault is treated somewhat lightly, almost comically, with the ridiculous figure of Priapus and the absurd intervention of the braying donkey. There's no real consequence for Priapus beyond being chased away from that particular feast. The emphasis is on Hestia's purity being preserved rather than on the violence of the attempted assault or the trauma it might have caused. But perhaps what's most revealing is that this is the only real story the Greeks and Romans felt the need to tell about Hestia involving any kind of conflict or threat. Even in mythology, even in fiction, Hestia's life is quiet, uneventful, defined by duty and peace rather than by dramatic incidents. The one time someone threatened that peace, the natural world itself intervened to preserve it, and the cosmic order reasserted itself. Hestia returned to her hearth, the fire kept burning, and the quiet goddess continued her eternal watch, undisturbed by the briefly interrupted feast, constant as always. There's a story that gets repeated often in modern retellings of Greek mythology. It goes like this. Originally, Hestia was one of the 12 Olympian gods, seated on a throne in Zeus's palace. But when Dionysus, the god of wine, came to claim his place among the Olympians, there was a problem. There were only 12 thrones, and all of them were occupied. Rather than cause conflict, Hestia graciously gave up her throne to Dionysus and withdrew from the council, choosing instead to tend the hearth at the center of the hall. This sacrifice prevented a civil war among the gods and demonstrated Hestia's commitment to peace and harmony. It's a nice story. It fits with Hestia's characterization as peaceful and self-effacing. It explains why Dionysus, despite being a later addition to Greek religion, became one of the 12 Olympians, while Hestia is sometimes excluded from that count. It gives Hestia one more example of putting others before herself, of choosing her duty over prestige. There's only one problem. This story is almost certainly a modern invention. Here's what we actually know from ancient sources. The composition of the 12 Olympian gods was not fixed in ancient Greece. Different city-states, different time periods, and different sources gave different lists. Most lists included Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, and Hermes. That's 11. The 12th spot varied. Sometimes it was Hestia, sometimes it was Dionysus, sometimes it was both, with one of the more commonly listed gods dropped from a particular count. Hades was occasionally included, though more often he was considered separate because he dwelt in the underworld rather than on Olympus. In some lists, Hebe, the goddess of youth, was counted. In others, Eros, the god of love, or Persephone. The point is, there was no single authoritative list that all Greeks agreed upon at all times. The concept of the 12 Olympians was more of a general framework than a rigid roster. Now, where does the story of Hestia giving up her throne to Dionysus come from? The earliest clear statement of it appears to be in Robert Graves's The Greek Myths, published in 1955. Graves was a poet and novelist who wrote extensively about mythology, but he was not a classical scholar in the academic sense, and he frequently invented or embellished stories based on his own theories about ancient religion and goddess worship. In the Greek Myths, Graves wrote, "Finally, having established his worship throughout the world, Dionysus ascended into heaven and now sits at the right hand of Zeus as one of the 12 great gods. The self-effacing goddess Hestia resigned her seat at the high table in his favor, glad of any excuse to escape the jealous wranglings of her family, and knowing that she could always count on a quiet welcome in any Greek city which it might please her to visit." Notice that Graves presents this as fact, but provides no ancient source for the claim. And indeed, scholars who have searched the ancient literature extensively have found no Greek or Roman text that tells this story. The idea that Hestia specifically gave up her throne to avoid conflict when Dionysus arrived seems to be Graves's invention or extrapolation. That said, there are ancient sources that acknowledge the variation in who was counted among the 12 Olympians. The Greek writer Herodotus mentions that different peoples had different lists of gods. Plato, in the Phaedrus, notes that there was debate in Athens about whether Hestia or Dionysus should be included among the 12. This suggests that by Plato's time in the 4th century BCE, there was recognition that both deities were important, but that they couldn't both be on a fixed list of 12. But that's very different from saying Hestia gave up her throne. It's simply acknowledging that different traditions counted differently. In regions where Dionysian worship was particularly strong, Dionysus might be included in the 12. In regions where the cult of Hestia was emphasized, she would be included. There was no drama, no moment of sacrifice, no throne giving, just different local traditions reflecting different religious priorities. The archaeological evidence actually tends to support Hestia's inclusion in the earlier lists. A famous relief from the 1st century BCE to 1st century CE, now in the Walters Art Museum, depicts 12 Olympian gods in procession. The figures are identified by their attributes: Hestia with a scepter, Hermes with a winged cap and staff, Aphrodite veiled, Ares with helmet and spear, Demeter with scepter and wheat sheaf, Hephaestus with staff, Hera with scepter, Poseidon with trident, Athena with owl and helmet, Zeus with thunderbolt and staff, Artemis with bow and quiver, and Apollo with cithara. Notice that Hestia is included and Dionysus is not. This doesn't prove that Hestia never gave up her throne, but it does suggest that in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, when this relief was made, Hestia was still being counted among the 12 in at least some contexts. So where does that leave us? The most likely explanation is that the composition of the 12 Olympians shifted over time as Greek religion evolved. Hestia was probably more prominent in the earlier periods, when domestic cult and hearth worship were central to Greek religious life. As Greek culture became more urbanized and more culturally diverse, particularly in the Hellenistic period after Alexander the Great's conquests, Dionysian worship gained prominence. Dionysus represented wine, theater, ecstatic experience, the breaking down of social boundaries. In a cosmopolitan, culturally mixed society, these aspects of religion became increasingly appealing. Over time, in many contexts, Dionysus was counted among the 12 Olympians, and Hestia was not. But this wasn't because of a specific mythological event where she gave up her throne. It was just cultural shift, changing religious priorities, the natural evolution of belief and practice. That said, the modern myth of Hestia giving up her throne does capture something true about her character, as the Greeks portrayed it. Even if the specific story is invented, it aligns with what we know about Hestia. She was self-effacing. She did value peace and harmony over personal glory. She did choose to stay at the hearth rather than involve herself in the dramas and conflicts of the other gods. So in that sense, the story is true to her spirit, even if it's not historically accurate. But it's important to distinguish between what the ancient Greeks believed and what modern writers have invented or inferred. The ancient Greeks saw Hestia as essential, honored her first at every sacrifice, maintained her hearth fires in every home and city. They didn't need a story about her giving up a throne to understand her importance. They lived that importance every day. Whether she sat on a throne in Zeus's palace, or tended the hearth at the center of the hall, or simply remained in her own eternal dwelling, she was Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, the first and the last, the constant flame. And that was always enough. When Rome conquered Greece, or as the Romans themselves might have put it, when Rome brought Greek culture under the protection of Roman order, the gods made the journey west. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Poseidon became Neptune, Aphrodite became Venus, and Hestia became Vesta. The names are clearly related linguistically, both deriving from the same ancient root meaning to dwell or to burn. But while the name was similar and the basic function remained the same, goddess of the hearth and home, the way Vesta was worshipped in Rome represented something of a transformation. Roman religion took the gentle domestic Hestia and turned her into a pillar of the state, a goddess whose flame literally represented the survival of the Roman people. The Romans were always more practical, more civic-minded than the Greeks. Where Greek religion was deeply personal and tied to individual family worship, Roman religion was profoundly public and political. The gods were seen as protectors of the state first, individual families second. So while Romans certainly maintained domestic hearths and honored Vesta in their homes, the real center of Vesta's worship was the Temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum. This temple was one of the most sacred sites in Rome. It was a round building, deliberately designed to echo the shape of ancient round huts with central hearths. Inside burned the sacred fire of Vesta, and this fire was considered absolutely essential to Rome's survival. As long as it burned, Rome would endure. If it ever went out, disaster would follow. This wasn't just superstition or metaphor to the Romans. They genuinely believed that the Vestal flame was tied to the fate of their civilization. Historical records tell us that on the rare occasions when the fire did go out, accidentally or through negligence, it was considered a catastrophic omen. Public ceremonies were held to ritually relight it. Scapegoats were sought. The people panicked. The fire was tended by the Vestal Virgins, priestesses who dedicated 30 years of their lives to Vesta's service. This was an extraordinary institution, one that had no real parallel in Greek religion. While Greek priesthoods existed, they were usually part-time positions held by citizens who also had other responsibilities. The Vestals, by contrast, were full-time religious professionals, living together in a complex near the temple, their entire lives structured around maintaining the sacred flame and performing rituals for the goddess. There were 6 Vestals at any given time. Girls were selected for the position between the ages of 6 and 10, chosen from aristocratic families by the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. Once selected, a girl would enter training and then serve as a Vestal for 30 years, 10 years learning her duties, 10 years performing them, and 10 years training the next generation. After 30 years, she was free to leave the order, marry, and live a normal life. Though in practice, many Vestals chose to remain in service for the rest of their lives. During their time as Vestals, these women took a vow of absolute chastity. This was not optional or negotiable. Breaking the vow was considered one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, a violation of the sacred contract between Rome and the gods. The punishment was horrific. A Vestal found guilty of breaking her vow of chastity would be buried alive in an underground chamber, sealed in with a small amount of food and water, and left to die slowly in the dark. This punishment was not common. It happened only a handful of times in Rome's history, but the threat of it was always present, a reminder of the seriousness with which Romans took Vesta's virginity and the Vestal's role as living embodiments of the goddess's purity. But if the Vestals bore an enormous burden of responsibility, they also received extraordinary privileges. They were among the most respected people in Rome, honored above even most male citizens. They had the best seats at public games and festivals. They could own property in their own names, unusual for women in Rome. They could make wills without a male guardian's approval. They could pardon condemned criminals by chance encounter. If they witnessed an execution taking place and interceded, the sentence had to be commuted. They were also politically influential. Emperors consulted them. Important state documents were kept in their care. They played crucial roles in major public ceremonies. In many ways, the Vestals were the closest thing Rome had to an independent female power structure. All of this grew out of Vesta's worship, but it represented something distinctly Roman. The Greeks had never created such an elaborate priestly institution around Hestia. Greek priestesses existed, certainly, but they were usually married women from prominent families who served part-time, often combining religious duties with household responsibilities. The idea of virgin priestesses living communally for decades, their chastity enforced by threat of death, was a Roman innovation. The Roman conception of Vesta also emphasized her civic role more strongly than the Greeks had emphasized Hestia's. In Rome, Vesta was explicitly the goddess of the Roman state, not just of individual homes. Her hearth in the temple represented the hearth of Rome itself, and every Roman family's domestic hearth was seen as connected to and protected by the state hearth. The colonial practice of carrying fire from the mother city to the colony was maintained and even amplified in Roman practice, with new settlements receiving flame from the Temple of Vesta to establish their legitimacy and connection to Rome. Some Roman traditions and myths about Vesta had no Greek equivalent. For instance, Romans told a story about how their legendary founder Romulus was conceived by Vesta, appearing as a phallus in the hearth fire and impregnating a Vestal Virgin. This miraculous conception was seen as evidence of Vesta's direct involvement in Rome's founding, making her not just a protective deity, but an ancestral one. The Greeks told no comparable stories about Hestia directly producing offspring or participating in heroic genealogies. The festival of Vestalia, held from June 7 to 15, was one of the most important religious celebrations in the Roman calendar. During this period, the Temple of Vesta was open to married women, but not men, who would come barefoot to make offerings and prayers for their families. On June 15th, the last day of the festival, the temple was ceremonially swept and cleansed, and the accumulated debris was carried out and thrown into the Tiber River. This cleansing ritual had no clear Greek precedent in Hestia worship, but fit with Roman ideas about lustration, purification, and the importance of ritual cleanliness. Interestingly, donkeys were honored during Vestalia, decorated with wreaths and flowers. This may have been a carryover from the Greek story about the donkey saving Hestia from Priapus, but the Romans seem to have a different interpretation, linking donkeys to Vesta because they were used to turn millstones in bakeries, and baking bread was one of Vesta's domains. Despite these differences, the core of Vesta's worship remained tied to the same concepts as Hestia's: the hearth, the home, the sacred fire, purity, and domestic peace. Roman families still honored Vesta at their household hearths, still made offerings to her before meals, still invoked her in prayers for household harmony and prosperity. The shift was more one of emphasis and elaboration than of fundamental change. The Romans took what the Greeks had created and built a more formal, more state-centered cult around it. Vesta's worship continued in Rome long after most pagan cults had faded. Even as Christianity spread through the empire, even as temples to Jupiter and Mars were closed or converted to churches, the temple of Vesta remained active. The Vestal Virgins continued their duties, the sacred flame continued to burn. This ended in 394 CE, when the Christian Emperor Theodosius I ordered all pagan temples closed. The Vestals were disbanded, the sacred fire was extinguished. After more than 1,000 years of continuous burning, the flame went out, not through accident or negligence, but through imperial decree. It was symbolically the end of an era. The Roman world that had venerated Vesta, that had seen her flame as essential to civilization itself, was fading. A new order was rising, one that had no room for virgin priestesses tending eternal fires, one that saw the old gods as demons or delusions, rather than as protectors of home and state. But the legacy remained. The very word Vestal entered the English language, carrying connotations of purity, virginity, dedication. The image of the Vestal Virgin, dressed in white, tending a sacred flame, became iconic, reproduced in art and literature for centuries after the actual Vestals were gone. And in a way, every time someone lights a candle, every time someone gathers family around a table, every time someone speaks of the warmth of home or the sanctity of the household, there's an echo of Vesta and of Hestia before her. The goddess endured, not in temples or through priestesses, but in the very concept of what it means to have a home, to belong somewhere, to gather around the fire with the people you love. Unlike many Greek goddesses, Hestia was rarely depicted in elaborate sculptures or grand temple friezes. There are no famous statues of her, like there are of Athena or Aphrodite. No iconic poses that artists replicated across centuries. Her image, when it appeared at all, was modest, simple, understated. This was deliberate. Hestia didn't need grandiose representations because she was already represented in every hearth fire, in every household. The flame itself was her image, her body, her presence made manifest. Why sculpt her in marble when she could be seen in the living light and warmth of the fire? When Greek artists did choose to depict Hestia, they usually showed her as a woman clothed in modest robes, often with a veil covering her head. The veil was important symbolically. It signified her virginity, her modesty, her choice to remain somewhat removed from the more public, dramatic aspects of Olympian life. Veiling was associated with respectable married women in Greek society, but for Hestia, it served a different purpose. It marked her as set apart, dedicated to her sacred duty rather than to any individual man. She was often shown seated on a simple wooden throne or bench, not the ornate golden thrones of other Olympians, but something plain, practical, functional. This throne usually had a white wool cushion, emphasizing comfort and domesticity rather than majesty and power. Sometimes she held a staff or scepter, a symbol of authority, but even this was usually understated compared to the elaborate scepters held by Zeus or Hera. In some artistic representations, Hestia is shown with a kettle or a pot, tools of hearthwork, of cooking and food preparation. This grounded her imagery in the practical, everyday aspects of her domain. She wasn't just symbolically related to the hearth, she was actively involved in the work that happened there. Fire itself is, of course, her primary symbol, not the destructive fire of war or the forge fire of Hephaestus, but the gentle, controlled fire of the hearth. This fire provides light, warmth, and the means to prepare food. It's essential, but not aggressive, powerful but contained, dangerous if mishandled but beneficial when tended properly. The Greeks understood fire as having a purifying quality. It consumed impurities, transformed raw ingredients into cooked food, and kept darkness at bay. Hestia's fire had all these qualities, but also a spiritual dimension. The hearth fire was where sacrifices were burned, where prayers rose with the smoke, where the mortal and divine realms met. In this sense, Hestia's fire was a gateway, a liminal space between Earth and Olympus. One of her sacred animals was the domestic pig, which makes sense given that pigs were common sacrificial animals, and their sacrifice would have taken place at the hearth. Pigs were also associated with home and farmyard rather than with wilderness, fitting Hestia's domestic nature. In Roman worship, the donkey became associated with Vesta for the reasons we've discussed, and this may have carried back to influence later Greek practice as well. Perhaps because she was so rarely depicted in art, when Hestia did appear in scenes with other gods, she was sometimes difficult to identify with certainty. Unlike Athena with her distinctive helmet and aegis, or Artemis with her bow, or Poseidon with his trident, Hestia had no single identifying attribute that appeared in every representation. She was more likely to be identified by context. If a modestly dressed goddess is shown near a hearth or with a kettle, it's probably Hestia, than by any unique iconography. This ambiguity in artistic representation fits with Hestia's nature. She was not a goddess of spectacle or display. She didn't need to announce herself visually because her presence was felt in more subtle ways. You didn't need a statue to know Hestia was there. You felt her in the warmth, saw her in the flame, sensed her in the comfort and security of home. The Hestia Justiniani, a Roman marble statue based on a 5th century BCE Greek original, is one of the few surviving large-scale representations of the goddess. It shows her seated, draped in heavy robes, her head covered, her expression serene and somewhat distant. There's a majesty to the figure, but it's a quiet majesty, dignified rather than commanding. She doesn't demand attention. She simply exists, solid and present and enduring. This statue was found in Rome and is now part of the Torlonia collection. The fact that it's a Roman copy of a Greek original tells us that even as worship shifted from Hestia to Vesta, even as practices changed, there remained a desire to have some visual representation of the goddess, some way to honor her in stone as well as in flame. In later Western art, particularly during the Renaissance and neoclassical periods, Vesta became a popular subject. Artists depicted Vestal Virgins tending the sacred flame, often in romanticized settings that emphasized the virginal purity and classical beauty of the priestesses rather than the goddess herself. These paintings and sculptures tell us more about the artist's own time period's fascination with antiquity than they do about actual ancient worship. But they do show that the image of the goddess of the hearth continued to resonate. Symbolically, Hestia came to represent certain concepts that transcended her specific mythological identity. She embodied domesticity, certainly, but also stability, permanence, the center that holds. In an increasingly chaotic world, Hestia represented the possibility of peace, of a place to return to, of constancy amid change. The hearth as symbol has remained potent through the centuries. Even now, when most homes don't have literal hearths anymore, the concept persists. We speak of the heart of the home, usually meaning the kitchen or the dining room where the family gathers. We value hearth and home as an ideal, a place of belonging and warmth. We understand instinctively what the Greeks understood consciously, that there needs to be a center, a place that is protected and nurturing, where we can rest and reconnect. Hestia gave form to this need. She made it sacred. She elevated the simple act of tending a fire and preparing a meal into something divine. And her symbols, simple as they were, the flame, the kettle, the modest veil, carried that understanding forward through the ages. You don't need elaborate iconography to recognize the goddess of home. You just need to feel the warmth, see the light, and know that you belong. We live in a world that has largely moved past hearth fires. Most of us cook on electric stoves or gas ranges. We heat our homes with furnaces and radiators. The open flame, if we see it at all, is likely to be a candle for ambiance or a lighter for a cigarette. We don't depend on fire the way the ancient Greeks did. We don't gather around it. We don't organize our homes around a central hearth. And yet, Hestia's influence persists. Consider what we value in the concept of home: safety, warmth, belonging. A place to return to after being out in the world. A space that is ours, protected, where we can let down our guard and simply be ourselves. These are not new values. They're not modern inventions. They're the same things the ancient Greeks valued when they honored Hestia. The form has changed, but the essence remains. We no longer have a literal fire burning in the center of our homes, but we still have gathering spaces. The kitchen table where the family eats together, the living room where everyone congregates in the evening. These spaces serve the same function the hearth once did. They're the center, the place where the family comes together, where bonds are formed and maintained, Hospitality remains a virtue, even if we don't invoke Hestia's name when we welcome guests into our homes. We still understand that offering someone food and shelter is a kind of sacred act, that treating a guest well reflects on our own character and honor. The Greek concept of xenia, of guest friendship protected by the gods, finds echo in our own cultural emphasis on hospitality and generosity. The idea of beginning and ending a meal with gratitude, though now more likely to be a secular bon appetit or a religious grace specific to other traditions, carries forward the practice of acknowledging that food and community are gifts, that gathering to eat is more than just biological necessity. The Greeks thanked Hestia. We may not name a goddess, but the impulse to mark the meal as special, to pause and recognize what we have, that impulse is the same. Even our language preserves echoes of Hestia and the hearth. We speak of the hearth and home, treating them as synonymous. We describe warm, welcoming people as having a warm hearth, or creating a homey atmosphere. We use fire metaphors for passion and life. Someone whose dynamic is fiery. Someone who's lost their motivation has lost their fire. These aren't deliberate invocations of Hestia, but they come from the same understanding that animated her worship. Fire is life, warmth is love, the center holds. In some modern pagan and Hellenic polytheist communities, Hestia has seen something of a revival. People who practice reconstructed Greek religion honor her in ways that try to be as close to ancient practice as possible. They maintain household shrines with an oil lamp, representing her eternal flame. They invoke her at the beginning and end of rituals. They see her as the foundation of their practice, the goddess who makes everything else possible. But Hestia's influence extends beyond explicitly religious contexts. The entire modern emphasis on self-care, on creating a home environment that supports mental and emotional health, on establishing routines and rituals that provide stability, these are all, in a sense, acts of Hestia worship. They recognize that having a center, having a place that is safe and nurturing, is essential to human well-being. Psychology has confirmed what the Greeks intuitively understood, that a stable, secure home life is foundational for healthy development and continued thriving. Children need a secure base from which to explore the world. Adults need a place to retreat to rest, to recover. Without that center, without that metaphorical hearth, people struggle. They become unmoored, anxious, unable to fully engage with life because they have no place of safety to return to. Hestia then represents something that humans need across all times and cultures. The specifics change. The hearth becomes the kitchen, the goddess becomes a metaphor, the rituals transform, but the underlying human need for home, for belonging, for a sacred center, that never changes. Perhaps that's why Hestia, despite her quiet nature, despite her absence from dramatic myths, despite having relatively few temples in her honor, was nonetheless considered so essential by the ancient Greeks. They understood that all the other gods, all the other aspects of life, all the adventures and achievements and dramas, only made sense if there was a home to return to. Only made sense if there was a hearth burning somewhere, waiting. Zeus could rule the cosmos, but without Hestia's hearth he'd have no throne room. Athena could win great victories, but without Hestia's hearth there'd be no cities to defend. Dionysus could bring ecstasy and wine, but without Hestia's hearth there'd be nowhere to celebrate. Hestia was the foundation, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. Not the loudest or the flashiest or the most powerful in the conventional sense, but the most necessary, the most essential, the one you couldn't do without. And so her flame burns still, even now, even in a world so different from ancient Greece. It burns in every light we turn on to welcome someone home, in every meal we prepare with care, in every space we create to be safe and warm, in every act of hospitality, every moment of domestic peace, every time we gather with the people we love and feel, however briefly, that we are exactly where we belong. That's Hestia's gift. That's her power. That's her eternal flame. And it will burn as long as humans need a home. We've come to the end of our journey tonight, the end of this exploration of Hestia, goddess of the hearth and home. We've traced her story from her birth and immediate swallowing by Cronus, through her emergence as the last of his children, to her choice to remain a virgin and dedicate herself to her quiet but essential work. We've explored what the hearth meant to the ancient Greeks, both in individual homes and in the civic life of the polis. We've examined the few myths that involve her, the transformation of her worship in Rome, and the lasting influence of her symbols and her concept. And through it all, we've seen a goddess who achieved something remarkable: significance without drama, power without force, immortality without needing grand stories to sustain it. Hestia teaches us that not everything important is loud, that the center can be quiet, that the most essential work is often the most invisible, that choosing peace and service over glory and recognition is not weakness but wisdom. In a world that often seems to value only the dramatic, the sensational, the spectacular, Hestia reminds us of the profound importance of the ordinary, the warm meal shared with family, the safe space to rest, the light that keeps the darkness at bay. These are not small things, they are in fact everything. So the next time you light a candle, or sit down to eat with people you love, or simply feel that sense of being home, remember Hestia. She may not have temples anymore. She may not receive sacrifices, but she's still there, in the warmth and the light and the sense of belonging. Still tending the flame, still keeping watch, still offering, to anyone who needs it, the eternal promise of home. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Hestia's mythology and meaning, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And let me know in the comments what other myths, gods, or legends you'd like to explore. The ancient world has so many stories to tell, and I'd love to continue this journey with you. Until next time, may your own hearth burn bright. May you always find your way home, and may the quiet peace that Hestia represents be with you now and always. Good night.